He threw a bottle of wine in her face right in the middle of a Seoul high society gala, in front of hundreds of people, thinking she had nothing left to lose. But he didn't know that the man standing on the stairs behind him was the most powerful gangster in South Korea. And that man had just seen it all. Today's story is about a woman betrayed, erased from her own life, and her fight to reclaim it all. If you're watching this video, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The taxi smelled like cigarettes and pine sol, and Selena Vale pressed her back against the cracked vinyl seat and watched Seoul bleed past the rain-streaked window in long neon smears. Red, green, the gutted yellow of a fried chicken sign 3 stories up. The city had a way of moving like it didn't need you, like it had already filed you under irrelevant and moved on, and all you could do was try to keep pace. She was good at that, keeping pace, disappearing into the rhythm of somewhere that didn't know her name. The dress was borrowed, silver, too formal, the kind of thing a woman wore when she was trying to look like she belonged somewhere she didn't. Her client, a compact, nervous man named Park Dae-won, who ran a small chain of high-end restaurants and dreamed aggressively about being taken seriously, had made attendance non-negotiable. The Phoenix Foundation Gala at the Imperial Crown Hotel. Kang Min-jae's annual event. The one people in Seoul talked about the way they talked about weather, with a certain resigned awe, like it was a natural force you didn't negotiate with, you just braced. Selena hadn't wanted to go. Selena hadn't wanted to do a lot of things in the last 3 years. She'd gotten good at doing them anyway. The taxi stopped at a red light, and she looked at herself in the dark window glass. The woman looking back was 34 years old and looked exactly like someone who had survived something without fully processing it. There were shadows under her eyes that concealer couldn't completely bury. Her jaw had a set to it now. Not elegant tension, not the kind magazines called strong, but the specific tightness of a person who had stopped letting her face do anything it hadn't explicitly approved first. She had good cheekbones. She'd always had good cheekbones. Adrian used to say they were her best feature, which had felt like a compliment at the time. She'd learned eventually what it actually meant, that her cheekbones were acceptable, that everything else needed refinement, that her ideas were interesting but too ambitious, her instincts were sharp but needed tempering, her vision was good but benefited from his guidance. 3 years of gradient erosion. By the time it was over, she hadn't been able to tell where his voice ended and her own thoughts began. The light changed. The taxi moved. Seoul kept bleeding. She thought about the work. She always thought about the work when the other thoughts got too loud. The Mirai Restaurant Project, Park Dae-won's newest location in Gangnam, a mid-century Korean fusion concept with a structural problem on the east wall and a lighting brief that kept shifting every time she thought she'd nailed it. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. That was the one thing no one had managed to take from her entirely, though Adrian had tried hard enough. Her name back then had been worth something. Not famous. Architects rarely got famous, the good ones anyway, but respected. Selena Vale, principal architect at Halcyon Group, New York, quoted in Architectural Digest at 29, invited to pitch for the Meridian Cultural Center project at 30, which would have been the kind of commission that defined a career. She had given 3 years of her life to that pitch. Every hour she wasn't billing other clients, every weekend, every 2 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come, and her brain kept churning through structural load calculations and aesthetic theory and how to make something that felt necessary rather than decorative. The pitch was stolen. Her name was removed. The fraud charges came 8 weeks later, constructed so elegantly she still, sometimes, in the quiet dark hours, almost admired the craftsmanship. Adrian Cross had a talent for architecture himself, just not the kind that involved buildings. The taxi stopped in front of the Imperial Crown Hotel, and Selena sat there for 2 seconds longer than she needed to. Then she paid the driver and got out into the rain. The Imperial Crown was the kind of building that made you feel small on purpose. 42 floors of dark glass and polished stone, illuminated from below in cold white light so that it seemed to float slightly above the street, detached from the ordinary city around it. The lobby entrance was flanked by 4 security personnel in suits so well cut they functioned as a kind of architectural statement. "We take ourselves seriously," the building said. "You should, too." She checked her coat accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, and did not drink it. She stood near the edge of the room and watched. The ballroom on the main floor was enormous. 30-foot ceilings, chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions, floors of white marble veined with something that might have been gold or might have been very convincing paint. The guest list was the kind of thing that made Selena's skin prickle in a way she couldn't fully name. Politicians, CEOs, a famous actress whose face she recognized from a billboard on the expressway, men in groups of 3 and 4 who held their champagne wrong, too loose, too comfortable, in the specific way of people for whom power was so ambient it had become invisible to them. She found Park Dae-won near the east end of the room, vibrating slightly with anxiety. "You came," he said, relief cracking through his formal tone. "You told me I had to. I told you it would be good for the business. It's different." "It's not different, Mr. Park." She scanned the room over his shoulder, cataloging exits automatically. Old habit. "Who do I need to meet?" He started talking, names, connections, which vice president of which conglomerate had expressed interest in the Gangnam project, which city planning official might be persuadable on the East Wall permit issue. She listened, filed, tracked his nervous hands with peripheral vision while her eyes continued their methodical inventory of the room. She almost missed him. Not because he was hard to see. Adrian Cross had never been hard to see. He was built for rooms exactly like this one, tall and golden-haired and wearing money with the ease of someone born into it rather than someone who'd taken it from other people. He moved through the crowd near the center of the room with that specific gravity he'd always had, the one that made other people orient toward him without quite understanding why. Selena's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down on a passing server's tray without looking. Every rational thought she had said the same thing clearly: leave. Walk to the coat check, call a taxi, disappear back into the Seoul that didn't know her name, and spend the next week designing the East Wall solution and billing Park Dae-won for the hours, and not thinking about this room or that man or the version of herself that had believed, for 3 years, that love was the thing happening to her. She had already turned. She was already moving toward the exit, navigating through the thick current of expensive fabric and cologne and low, polite laughter. "Well," the voice came from her left, close enough to be intimate, loud enough to carry. The ghost finally came back. She stopped, turned. Adrian Cross stood 4 feet away with a champagne flute in one hand and an expression on his face that she recognized from the worst moments of her life. That specific compound of amusement and contempt that he'd deployed when he wanted her to understand how little she mattered while maintaining plausible deniability about cruelty. His eyes were the same pale blue she remembered. They had not changed at all. Some things didn't. Nearby guests had already turned. Conversations paused. The small, awful radius of public spectacle was opening around them, and there was nothing she could do about it except choose how she stood inside it. "Adrian," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that, distantly. "I heard you were in Seoul." He stepped closer, forcing her to hold her ground or retreat visibly. "I didn't believe it. Selena Vale, hiding in Asia, seemed to—" He tilted his head, performed a small frown of consideration. "Small, for you. You always talked about legacy." "I'm not hiding." "No?" He looked at her. The borrowed dress, the careful posture, the glass she'd put down. "What would you call it?" People were watching. More people now, the radius expanding. She could feel it on the back of her neck, the soft weight of collective attention, and she knew exactly what was happening and exactly what she should do, and her body was doing approximately none of it. Her hands were cold. Her jaw was doing the thing it did. She was 34 years old and 3 years removed from the worst day of her life, and standing in a ballroom in Seoul wearing someone else's dress, and Adrian Cross was looking at her like she was a story he'd already finished telling. "I'm working," she said. "Excuse me." She moved a step past him. He moved with her, not blocking, just adjusting, mirroring the subtle choreography of someone who'd had a long time to learn exactly how to keep her off balance without touching her. "You look tired," he said. "Honestly, I'm not being unkind. You look like someone who's been running for a long time and hasn't slept properly in years." He raised his glass, studied it.
I heard about the Chandler project and the Tate renovation. Both went to firms you used to work above. That must be, I'm not doing this. Genuinely painful. Because you were good, Selena. You were. The Meridian pitch was exceptional work. I've always said that. His voice dropped half a register, that private register she used to think was intimacy, and later understood was just a technique. I actually said that to the committee, after you submitted it under your name. The smile didn't move. After the investigation concluded, after the committee determined the intellectual authorship was disputed, after your firm reviewed the situation and made the decision that you paid them to make, in the best interests of everyone involved. He shrugged. One shoulder, elegant. You've always had trouble with the collaborative nature of the industry. That was your limitation, not mine. She had 1,000 things to say. They had been composting in her chest for 3 years, fermenting down from rage into something darker and more refined, and she could feel them pushing at the inside of her ribs right now, this precise moment, wanting out. She said nothing, because nothing she said would matter. That was the thing she'd learned hardest. Not in the courtroom, not in the mediation sessions, not in the terrible final meeting at Halcyon where they'd read her the terms of the settlement that would keep her out of prison for crimes she hadn't committed. She'd learned it the night before all of that, sitting alone in her apartment watching the snow fall on West 72nd Street, understanding that he had built a machine that processed her into something smaller, and no individual sentence of hers could disassemble that machine. Language was not the tool for this. She turned away. Adrian's voice followed her. You should have stayed buried. And then the cold weight of liquid hit her. Not a splash. An intention. He'd aimed. The wine took her across the right side of her face and her shoulder and ran down the silver dress in a dark red cascade, and there was a sound from the room. A collective intake. That specific silence that crowds produce when something has crossed a line and everyone simultaneously understands it. And Selena stood there with wine in her eye and her ear and dripping from her jaw onto the marble floor, and the dress that wasn't hers was ruined, and the room was staring at her, and Adrian Cross was wearing an expression of relaxed satisfaction like a man who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. The silence held. Selena didn't move. Couldn't. Her whole body had locked up somewhere between humiliation and a rage so cold and complete it had temporarily disconnected her from her own motor function. She could feel her heartbeat in her face. She could feel the wine cooling against her skin. She could feel 200 pairs of eyes doing the work that Adrian had always done, measuring her, filing her, deciding how much she was worth. Kneel. The voice came from above her. Not loud. And that was the thing about it, the thing that sent a ripple through the ballroom with more force than a shout would have. It was a flat, certain, unremarkable command, the kind of voice that had never needed volume because volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be obeyed. She looked up. At the top of the main staircase stood a man she recognized from the photograph in her research file. Park Dae-won had shown her a picture when she'd asked, 3 months ago, who exactly she was doing indirect work for. She'd studied it for 30 seconds and filed it and not thought about it again because she'd learned in Seoul that there were layers of the city you functioned adjacent to without looking directly at. Kang Min-jae, 41 years old. 5 feet 11 inches of contained stillness in a black suit that had been built around him rather than fitted to him. Black hair, no gray, though she'd read he was 41. A face that was not handsome in any conventional architectural sense. The jaw was too sharp, the eyes too dark, the expression too settled into something permanent and internal. But was the kind of face that once you'd seen it, other faces seemed to be practicing. His hands were clasped loosely behind his back. His weight was forward on his feet. He was looking at Adrian Cross with no particular emotion, which was somehow worse than anger. The security personnel who had been orbiting the room at intervals were moving, not running. No one in this room ran, but converging, the crowd parting ahead of them without instruction in the automatic way crowds behaved around force. Min-jae descended the stairs. Slowly, like a man descending stairs in his own home at whatever pace he chose. He crossed the floor. The crowd opened. He stopped 6 feet from Adrian, who had not yet recovered his expression.
The satisfaction had curdled into something between confusion and the beginning of real fear, the kind that hadn't fully assembled itself yet because the brain was still trying to determine whether this was the situation it appeared to be. "You spilled wine on my guest," Min-jae said. His voice at this distance was the same as from the stairs, flat, certain, like weather reporting. Adrian's face worked through several options quickly. He settled on confident. "This is a private matter between— I wasn't asking." Two of the security personnel stepped forward, not grabbing, not yet, just positioning, which was enough. The communication was architectural. "You are inside a space I control, and the geometry of that space has just changed." Adrian looked at the security men, looked at Min-jae, looked at the crowd, made a calculation, made the wrong one. "Do you know who I—" The security men didn't grab him. They didn't have to. Something happened in the structure of the room. Something in the arrangement of bodies and the specific quality of Min-jae's stillness. And Adrian Cross, venture capitalist, public golden couple half, destroyer of Selena Vale's career and life, and 3-year faith in her own judgment, went to his knees on the white marble floor of the Phoenix Foundation gala, like a man whose legs had been informed of a truth the rest of him was still catching up to. The room was utterly silent. Selena stood with wine drying on her face and watched the man who had taken everything from her kneeling on a ballroom floor and felt something she hadn't expected. Nothing clean, not satisfaction, not triumph, something more complicated and less comfortable. The visceral reality of watching power reassert itself, and the sudden acute awareness that the power reasserting itself was not hers and was not necessarily safe. Min-jae turned from Adrian to her. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a folded black silk handkerchief. He held it out to her. Selena stared at it for a moment, then at him. "Look at me," he said quietly. She did. His eyes were the darkest she'd ever seen on a living person. Not brown, genuinely black, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter in this light. They were not warm, they were not cold. They were simply present, fully, in a way that was disconcerting because she was not used to being fully seen, and she couldn't tell, looking at him, whether what he was seeing was something that worked in her favor or against it. "For tonight," he said, "no one humiliates you again." She took the handkerchief. Her hands were still cold. Later, much later, in the taxi back to her apartment in Mapogu, with the borrowed dress ruined in a bag on the seat beside her and the handkerchief in her coat pocket because she hadn't been able to give it back. The opportunity had passed, and then she was outside. And then she was in this car. She would try to identify what had happened in the moment she looked at Kang Min-jae and he said those words. She would try to frame it as threat assessment, as rational response to a dangerous situation, as the appropriate wariness of an intelligent woman who understood that protection offered by men with power was never offered without cost. All of those things were true. They were also not the whole truth. The whole truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. For the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her like she was worth something specific. Not generic kindness, not performed chivalry. Specific attention, specific intention, specific choice in a room full of easier options. And it had felt, for exactly 3 seconds, like something she used to know the name for before she forgot it. That was the most dangerous thing Kang Min-jae had done to her tonight. Not the protection, not the command that put Adrian on his knees, not the handkerchief or the look or the quiet certainty of his voice. The 3 seconds. She pressed her back against the taxi seat and watched Seoul bleed past the window in neon and rain, and told herself, with the focused determination of someone who'd survived worse, she would return the handkerchief, thank Park Dae-won for the connection, complete the Mirai restaurant project, and disappear back into the city that didn't know her real name. She was good at disappearing. She had been doing it for 3 years. She did not yet know that Kang Min-jae was better at finding things than she was at hiding them. She did not yet know that in the morning there would be a car waiting outside her building, black, quiet, without a driver she recognized. She did not yet know that Adrian Cross, kneeling on that marble floor in his ruined tuxedo, with cameras pointed at him from a dozen angles, had not been humiliated into surrender. He'd been humiliated into something far worse. And somewhere across the city, in a building she'd never been inside, in a room she'd never imagined. A man she'd never heard of was looking at photographs of the Phoenix Foundation gala and making plans that had Selena Vale's borrowed dress face at their center. The taxi stopped at a red light. She looked at herself in the dark window glass. The woman looking back had wine red staining the line of her jaw that the handkerchief hadn't quite removed, and eyes that had not yet decided what tonight meant. The car was there at 7:43 in the morning. Selena knew because she'd been awake since 5, sitting at her drafting table with the east wall calculations for the Mirai project spread across the surface and a cup of coffee going cold beside her left hand, and she'd looked out the window not because she expected anything, but because looking out windows was something she did when her brain wouldn't settle, when the calculations kept sliding off some internal surface that had been tilted wrong. The car was black, a Genesis G90, new enough that the paint still held a depth to it in the gray morning light. It was parked directly in front of her building's entrance with the engine off and no driver visible through the tinted glass. And it had been there, she estimated from the absence of exhaust in the cold air, for some time. She looked at it for 30 seconds. Then she went back to the east wall calculations and did not look at it again for 40 minutes, at which point she looked again, and it was still there. Engine still off, still patient, in the specific way of things that had decided to wait as long as they needed to. She finished her coffee cold. She showered. She dressed in the clothes she always wore to site visits: dark trousers, a gray work shirt, boots with actual soles. And she took the stairs down because the elevator in her building was slow, and she wanted the 6 flights to do something useful with the tension that had settled into her shoulders overnight. A man was standing beside the car. She hadn't seen him from above. He'd been on the street side, not the building side. Korean, mid-30s, in a black jacket, with the particular stillness of someone who'd been trained to wait without fidgeting. He had a face that communicated nothing except attentiveness. He held out an envelope. She didn't take it immediately. "Who sent you?" "Mr. Kang." "I don't have a meeting with Mr. Kang." "No," the man agreed. He kept holding out the envelope. His arm didn't waver. "The envelope explains." She took it. Ivory stock, heavy, her name written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. Precise, minimal, the handwriting of someone who had never needed to perform anything. Inside was a card, 4 lines. "Your current project has a permit issue with the Gangnam Cultural Heritage Office. I know the appropriate contact. Breakfast if you'd like. The car will take you. There is no obligation, no signature." She already knew the signature. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning air, with the card in her hand and the car waiting, and thought about 3 things in quick succession: the east wall permit, which had been stalled for 6 weeks, and was starting to genuinely threaten the project timeline; the word obligation, and the specific intelligence it took to put that word in the message; and the handkerchief, still in her coat pocket from last night, which she had not yet returned because the opportunity hadn't presented itself, and which she was now holding with both hands because the coat was the one she'd grabbed on the way out. She looked at the driver. "Where?" "Bukchon, 20 minutes." She got in the car. She told herself it was about the permit. The restaurant was small and deliberate, a Hanok-style building tucked into one of the narrow streets behind the old neighborhood walls, the kind of place that didn't have a sign outside because the people who needed to find it already knew where it was. Inside, the ceiling was low, and the light came from paper panels, and everything smelled like cedar and sesame and something she couldn't name. There were 4 tables, 3 were empty. At the 4th, near the window that looked onto a small enclosed garden with a bare persimmon tree, Kang Min-jae was reading something on his phone and had a cup of tea in front of him that he hadn't touched yet. He looked up when she came in, stood. Not performed courtesy, just a reflex, brief, like something installed early. He gestured at the chair across from him and sat back down when she did. She put the handkerchief on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. Something moved in his face, not a smile, not quite, and he picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket without comment. "Thank you for coming," he said. "The permit's been blocking me for 6 weeks." She held his gaze. "That's why I'm here." "I know." "So we understand each other." He picked up his tea. "The Heritage Office has a contact named Lim Sung Hwan. He handles special review applications for the Gangnam district. He's cautious about precedent, but responds well to detailed historical context documentation. Your east wall, and it's adjacent to a protected sightline from the 1968 survey grid. If your application includes a visual impact study showing the wall's setback doesn't affect the protected corridor, Lim will approve it within 10 days. He set the tea down. I can give you Lim's direct line. The rest is your work. Selena looked at him. Why? Because Park Dae-won is a good businessman and your design is correct for the building. The permit shouldn't be the failure point. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one. A server appeared, set down a small dish of banchan and 2 bowls of something that steamed quietly. Min-jae hadn't ordered it, which meant he'd ordered it before she arrived, which meant he'd been certain enough she'd come that he'd ordered for her. And she wasn't sure how she felt about that, whether it was presumptuous or simply efficient. She picked up her spoon, looked at him. Last night, she said, the man in the bar, Adrian. You knew who he was before you came down those stairs. Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He ate. She noticed he ate the same way he moved, without waste, without performance, the way of someone who'd gotten comfortable inside his own skin a long time ago and stopped apologizing for taking up space. I know who most people in that room were, he said. That's not an answer either. No. He considered something. I knew he'd arrived in Seoul 4 days ago. I knew he was attending the gala. I knew. A brief pause. Some of his history. Some. Enough. She set down her spoon. How much of last night was you deciding to intervene, and how much was you already planning to? The question sat on the table between them like the handkerchief had. He looked at it directly. I saw him throw the wine, Min-jae said. That was when I decided. But you knew he'd be there. Yes. And you knew I'd be there. The pause this time was different, not evasive. He didn't seem built for evasion, which was its own kind of unsettling in a man whose reputation was constructed from opacity. Just a pause that acknowledged the question was more precise than the previous ones and deserved more precision in return. Park Dae-won is a small investor in the foundation, Min-jae said. His RSVP listed his architect. I saw the name. Something shifted fractionally in his face. I recognized it. Selena felt a cold thread run through the back of her neck. From where? Architectural Digest, 2019. A piece on emerging designers in the Northeast Corridor. You were 3rd on the list. He met her eyes without apology. I have a long memory. She didn't know what to do with that. It was the most disarming thing he could have said, and she suspected he knew it, and she couldn't tell from looking at him whether that suspicion was fair or whether she was pattern matching him onto men who'd been calculating when they appeared spontaneous, and that uncertainty was the exact thing she couldn't afford. She picked up her spoon again. They ate without talking for a few minutes. The persimmon tree outside was very still in the windless cold. You said last night, she said finally, that you know what betrayal looks like. Yes. That was a strange thing to say to someone you don't know. Min-jae turned his teacup slowly on the table. Once. Set it parallel to the edge. My father ran a trading company, he said. Import, export, other things. He built it from a market stall in Namdaemun over 30 years. When I was 26, he called a peace meeting with 2 men who had been his competitors, and then his partners, and then, he'd recently discovered, his enemies. The meeting was at a neutral location. There was food, there was agreement, and there was a car accident on the way home that the police took 4 hours to rule non-suspicious. He looked at the persimmon tree. It took me 9 months to find the right documents. It took me 7 years to build the right position. It took me 1 night to make sure the men who made that phone call understood what a mistake felt like from the inside. Selena was quiet. So, he said, yes, I recognize it. She thought about her 3 years of careful invisibility. She thought about sitting in a New York courtroom and listening to her own work attributed to someone else's vision, her own emails selectively quoted, her own signature used against her. She thought about the specific texture of being taken apart by someone who knew exactly which structural supports to remove first. He's not done, she said. Min-jae looked at her. Adrian, she said.
What you did last night, putting him on his knees in front of those people, he won't process that as a warning. He doesn't have the architecture for it. He'll process it as a problem to solve. She heard her own voice going clinical, the way it did when she was trying to keep the emotional content from interfering with the analysis. He's going to do something. I know. That doesn't worry you. Most things people do when they're frightened and wounded are predictable. Min-jae's eyes were steady. What worries me is the things that aren't. She left an hour later with Lim Sung-hwan's direct number written on the back of the restaurant's plain card and the feeling, persistent and unwelcome, that she had stepped across a threshold she hadn't clearly seen until she was already on the other side of it. The flowers arrived on Thursday. No card. White. She put them in the only vase she owned, which was a mason jar she'd bought at a Mapogu convenience store, and stood looking at them for a moment before going back to the East Wall study, which was coming together now that she'd had a productive 40-minute phone call with Lim Sung-hwan that had been, as Min-jae predicted, responsive to precise historical documentation.
She told herself the flowers were a professional courtesy. On Friday evening, she ran into Min-jae at the Lotte Gallery in Jamsil, which she had gone to alone because there was an exhibition of Zaha Hadid's process drawings that she'd been meaning to see for 3 weeks. He was there with 2 men she didn't know and a woman she recognized from financial news. He saw her across the gallery space and walked over and dismissed the others with a word. They talked for an hour and 10 minutes about process, about what it meant to design for permanence in a city that was constantly demolishing itself. About the meridian pitch, she told him what it actually was, what she'd been trying to do with the load distribution along the south facade, and he listened in a way that people rarely listened, without preparing his response while she was still talking. Walking out, in the cold air of the parking structure, she said, "You do this deliberately." He looked at her. "Do what?" "Appear where I am." He was quiet for a moment. Their breath showed in the cold. "The gallery has been on my calendar for 2 weeks," he said. "That's not a denial." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at him for a long moment in the fluorescent light of the parking structure, with the cold coming up through the concrete floor and the distant sound of the city doing its permanent indifferent business. "I don't do complicated," she said. "I can't. I spent 3 years rebuilding something very small and functional, and I need it to stay intact." Min-jae looked at her without flinching. "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes." A pause. "I'm also not asking you for anything complicated." She didn't have an answer for that. She got in her own car and drove home through the Friday night traffic and sat in her apartment looking at the white flowers in the mason jar and thought about the specific shape of what wasn't being said. She didn't sleep well. Neither, across the city, in a suite at the Joseon Palace Hotel, did Adrian Cross, but for entirely different reasons. He had a glass of scotch he'd been ignoring for an hour and a laptop open to a news aggregator that had, in the last 48 hours, produced 4 separate articles about the Phoenix Foundation Gala incident. The footage was everywhere. Shot from 8 different angles, uploaded within hours, the combined view count was crossing 2 million and climbing. In all of it, you could see the same thing, Adrian Cross, in a tuxedo, throwing red wine across a woman's face. And then, from the staircase, Kang Min-jae's voice carrying across a silent room. "Kneel." And Adrian's legs going like something had been cut. His publicist had called 9 times. His New York attorney had sent a 7-paragraph email at 3 a.m. 2 of his current investors had made inquiries, polite, careful, the kind of inquiry that was really a notification. The KO Ventures partnership, the one he'd spent 14 months building, had gone quiet in a way that had texture to it. He poured the scotch down the hotel bathroom sink and stared at himself in the mirror. He had not come to Seoul for the gala. Or not only for the gala. He'd come because of a meeting 2 weeks earlier in Tokyo with a man named Yute Sik, who ran a collection of shell companies that served, if you knew how to read the financial architecture, as the investment arm of the Baekdo Syndicate. Yu was soft-spoken and wore glasses and had a PhD in economics from KAIST and had laid out, over 3 hours and a very good dinner, an opportunity that Adrian had spent the subsequent 2 weeks telling himself he was not seriously considering. The Baekdo syndicate wanted Kang Min-jae's financial network, specifically the encrypted account infrastructure that Min-jae used to move capital across 12 jurisdictions, the thing that was, according to Yu's analysis, the actual core of his empire, more important than his legitimate businesses, more important than his people, the thing that would take years to rebuild if it were suddenly removed from his control. What Yu needed was proximity. An inside line on Min-jae's movements, his security patterns, his vulnerabilities. Someone who moved in the same circles, who could build a plausible relationship, who could get close enough to gather the structural intelligence Baekdo needed to plan the extraction. The offer was $8 million. Adrian had said he needed to think about it. Then he'd come to Seoul and found Selena Vale in that ballroom and let his temper make a spectacle of him. And now his face was in every news aggregator in Asia, and Kang Min-jae had personally demonstrated, in front of 200 witnesses, exactly what he thought of Adrian's status. He called Yu Tae-sik at 11:30 at night. "I want to reconsider the arrangement," he said. There was a short silence on the line. "Mr. Cross," Yu said pleasantly, "we were hoping you might." The next morning, Selena submitted the visual impact study to Lim Sung-hwan's office. The East Wall permit was approved in 11 days. Park Dae-won nearly cried, which was embarrassing for both of them. The Myri restaurant project moved to the next phase, and Selena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, feeling something that was not quite happiness, but was in the neighborhood. The specific satisfaction of correct work moving forward correctly. Min-jae called on a Thursday evening. "Dinner," he said. "Not a question, not quite." "That's a short invitation." "The rooftop at Onjeom, 8 o'clock, I'll have the car sent." "I have my own car." "Yes," he said, and waited. She went. The rooftop at Onjeom was glass and warm light, and the Han River below them going dark and silver in the evening. And they ate and talked, and she found herself laughing at something he said about a developer who'd tried to bribe a city planning official with a very bad sculpture. And the laugh came out of her unexpectedly. Not the careful version she'd been deploying for 3 years in professional settings, but an actual laugh, and she heard it and felt something tighten in her chest at the recognition of it. Min-jae heard it too. He looked at her across the table with something in his face she couldn't completely read, not warmth exactly, too specific for warmth, and said nothing, which was somehow louder than anything he could have said. Walking out, she said, "You never talk about what you actually do." He was quiet for a moment. "Which part of what I do?" "All of it, what you are, what the foundation actually funds, where your money actually comes from." She stopped walking, made him stop. "I'm not naive, Min-jae. I grew up in Chicago. I know how certain kinds of power organize themselves." He faced her on the sidewalk. The river wind was cold off the Han, and her coat wasn't quite warm enough, and neither of these things were the point. "What do you want to know?" he said. "The truth." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did. That internal process she couldn't see but could feel the shape of, the deliberation happening behind eyes that had learned early to give nothing away by accident. "I run legitimate businesses," he said. "Construction, hospitality, finance. They are genuinely profitable. I also manage relationships with organizations that exist outside legal frameworks. I don't manufacture violence. I don't traffic people. I maintain order in spaces where the alternative to my order is chaos that hurts more people." A pause. "That is a self-serving description, and I know it." "At least you know it." "Knowing it doesn't change it." She looked at him. "Does it keep you up at night?" His jaw moved slightly. "Some nights." She nodded slowly, looked at the river, looked back. "Okay," she said. He looked confused. Just slightly, just enough to be human. "Okay?" "I'm not leaving. I'm not running." She pulled her coat tighter. "I've been running for 3 years and I'm tired, so..." "Okay." She looked at him. "But I need you to not lie to me about any of it. That's the only thing I actually can't survive again." Min-jae looked at her with those completely dark eyes and said, "Then I won't." She believed him. She would later understand that belief was not the same as safety. But standing on that sidewalk with the Han River cold behind her and the city loud around them and a man who had never pretended to be uncomplicated looking at her like she was the most specific thing in a room full of approximate shapes, she believed him. And she was 3 days away from finding out that the thing already in motion had started long before either of them had thought to look. The casino project documentation arrived in her inbox on a Monday, forwarded by Park Day One as a referral from a new development contact. A luxury gaming and entertainment complex in Incheon, early design phase, the client wanting conceptual direction before committing to a full architectural firm. Standard language. The attached files were 90 pages of site surveys, zoning documents, and preliminary structural briefs. Selena worked through them that evening with the east wall calculations pushed aside, because the project was interesting, genuinely interesting. The site had a complicated relationship with the harbor topography that would require creative structural thinking, and because the contract value attached was the largest she'd been offered in 3 years. She was 60 pages in, nearly midnight, when she got up for water and heard voices. Not inside. The building was quiet. Outside, on the small landing below her window that connected to the building's maintenance stairwell. 2 men speaking Korean quickly enough that she caught fragments rather than complete sentences. The window was open 2 inches because she ran hot when she worked. She stood very still. Her Korean was functional, reading level good, conversational in professional settings. Fast, abbreviated, anxious conversation between 2 people who didn't know they had an audience. She caught gala, caught Kang, caught what might have been auction in a context that felt wrong for the word. Then she caught a word she knew with the clarity of something that bypasses language entirely. The word was sarhai, kill, and then another word attached to it that she knew the way she knew her own face in the mirror. The name was Kang Min-jae. She stood with her hand on the window frame and her heart beating in a register she hadn't felt since the night in New York, when the police had come to her apartment with the fraud documents, and below her the voices continued fast and fragmented and then stopped. And then there were footsteps going away down the stairwell, and then nothing but the city and her own breathing. She looked at the casino documents on her desk. She looked at her phone. She picked it up. She pulled up Min-jae's number and then stood there with her thumb over the call button while her brain ran the calculation it always ran, the one that had kept her functional and invisible for 3 years. The cost-benefit of action versus stillness. The risk of being visible against the risk of being... She called him. 3 seconds of thumb hovering over the screen, 3 seconds of every learned instinct telling her to think before she acted, to verify before she committed, to be sure before she made herself visible. And then she pressed call and held the phone to her ear and stood at her window with the city below her, and the casino documents on her desk, and the word sarhai still bouncing off the inside of her skull. He picked up on the second ring. Selena. I need to tell you something. Her voice came out lower than she intended. She moved away from the window without fully deciding to. Old instinct. Put walls between yourself and open air when you're saying something that matters. I heard something. Outside my building. 2 men. A silence on his end. Not the silence of surprise, a different quality. The silence of someone shifting into a different gear. What did you hear? She told him. The fragments. Gala, Kang, auction, sarhai, his name. She spoke in short declarative sentences and did not editorialize and felt, as she talked, the specific clarity that came with adrenaline when your brain stripped everything down to transmission. When she finished, there was a pause of maybe 4 seconds. Are you in your apartment now? Yes? Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone until my people get there. 15 minutes. Min-jae. 15 minutes. A beat. You did right, calling me. He hung up. She locked the door. She stood in the center of her apartment and looked at the casino documents spread across her desk and felt the pieces begin assembling themselves into a shape she didn't yet want to name. The car arrived in 12 minutes. 2 men she didn't recognize, both in dark jackets, both with the same quality of trained stillness as the driver from the first morning. They didn't explain anything. They didn't need to. She grabbed her coat and her bag and the laptop because leaving the casino documents on a screen she'd been working on felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate but trusted, and she went with them. They took her to a building in Yongsan she'd never been to. Not Min Jae's penthouse, not any of the public-facing properties she'd come to associate with his orbit. A mid-rise with a parking structure entrance and fluorescent lights in the elevator, and the functional anonymity of a place that was not meant to be noticed. 8th floor. A room with good soundproofing and a table and 4 chairs and windows that were blacked out from outside. Min Jae was already there. He was standing when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the difference from the composed man at dinner 2 nights ago was specific and instructive. Not less controlled. Exactly as controlled. But the control was working harder, and she could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw and the way his hands were very still at his sides. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." He looked at her, didn't argue. "The charity auction. Tell me everything you heard again. Every word, every fragment, in the order you heard it." She went through it again, slowly this time, and he listened without interrupting and without writing anything down. And she understood from that, from the way he processed it all internally, no external record, that this was a mode he'd operated in before, many times. When she finished, he turned to the man standing near the door and said something in Korean too fast and clipped for her to follow. The man left immediately. Min Jae turned back to her. "The Incheon Casino project," he said. "How did it come to you?" Park Dae-won forwarded it, a referral from a development contact. What contact? He didn't specify a name. The email said a new business relationship. Something moved in Min Jae's face. Not surprise, worse than surprise, recognition, the expression of a person watching something they'd suspected take on confirmed shape. "The documentation in those files," he said carefully, "did any of it look like internal operational material, financial routing, personnel schedules, security protocols under development language?" Selena went still. She thought about the 90 pages. The site surveys, the zoning documents, yes, legitimate. But some of the structural briefs had referenced load-bearing specifications for what had been described as security infrastructure. Sub-basement access corridors. Reinforced server room requirements described as IT infrastructure. She'd read it as standard high-security commercial development. "The IT infrastructure section," she said slowly. "Page range. 63 to 71. Min Jae picked up his phone and made a call without breaking eye contact with her. 2 sentences of Korean. Hung up. "That file wasn't a casino project," he said. "The site is real. The development is real. But those pages were inserted. Whoever sent it to you wanted those pages in front of a specific set of eyes." Selena felt the cold move through her like water finding a crack. "They wanted me to see what was in those pages. Or they wanted to know if you would send those pages somewhere." He watched her. "Your laptop. Did you access the file from any network other than your home connection?" "No." "Did you forward anything? Screenshot, copy, any fragment?" "No, I was reading. I hadn't finished." He exhaled, very quietly. "Then you called me before they wanted you to." She understood what he meant. The cold in her chest didn't recede but changed quality. From the cold of shock to the cold of comprehension, which was different, heavier, more permanent. "I was bait," she said. "You were a vector." His voice was even. "There's a difference. Bait implies they needed you specifically. A vector is, I know what a vector is." She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't moderate it. "I'm an architect, not an idiot. Someone used me as a delivery mechanism to get operational intelligence in front of you, or to monitor whether I'd hand it to you and establish that I was an access point." She looked at him. "The question is who?" Min Jae looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said again, and this time there was something different under it. Not command, something more careful. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her, put both hands flat on the table. She'd noticed before that he did this when he was about to say something he'd weighed. The deliberate grounding of it, the physical signal that what followed was not improvised. 3 months ago, he said, someone inside my organization began feeding route information to the Baekdo syndicate.
Small things at first. Shipment timing. The kind of detail that could be coincidence. His eyes held hers. It wasn't coincidence. You have a leak. I had a suspicion. Now I have more. He looked at the table for a moment. The charity auction they mentioned. The Phoenix Foundation hosts a private auction in 12 days. It's not public. The guest list is 12 people. The auction is a mechanism. It's how certain capital transfers are legitimized through provenance records. He looked up. If someone is planning to use that event to move against me, they need interior information I don't publish. Security positioning, the routing of certain items before and after the event. That information exists in 3 places. He paused. One of them is a file I sent to my logistics coordinator 8 days ago. And the other 2? My personal records, and a secondary set held by my senior lieutenant, Cho Byung-soo. Selena absorbed this. Who has access to Cho? Min-jae's expression shifted into something she hadn't seen on his face before, not the controlled affect he usually wore, something that was making an effort not to be grief and was mostly succeeding. Cho has been with me for 11 years, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. No, he said quietly. It isn't. The next 72 hours moved in a way that felt both very fast and deeply strange, like the experience of a city during a blackout. Everything familiar operating under a different, more honest set of rules. Min-jae's people placed her in a different apartment. Seongdong District, a clean 2-bedroom in a building with better-than-average security and no connection to any address associated with her name. She was not told to stay inside, but she understood the geography of the instruction. Keep the radius small, move predictably, do not create new contact points. She worked on the Mirai project from the new desk because work was the anchor that had held her together for 3 years, and she was not going to surrender it now. She and Min-jae spoke twice daily. Brief, functional, status, her safety. The state of his internal investigation, delivered in fragments he clearly measured before transmitting. On the second day, he told her that the casino document had been traced back through Park Dae-won's referral chain to a shell company registered in Singapore that Baekdo's financial arm used for real estate obfuscation. Park Dae-won had not known. He'd received the referral through a third party he'd trusted for years, himself vectored without awareness. She felt a tired sadness about that. Park was nervous and status-hungry and sometimes exhausting, but he'd been straight with her, always. On the third day, Min-jae told her that 2 of the 3 access points for the auction security documents had been cleared. His logistics coordinator was eliminated as a source. The man's file access logs were clean, and his location tracking for the relevant period was verifiable. His own personal records were secure, which left Cho Byung-soo. She was working at the desk that evening when the door opened and Min-jae came in carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and the expression of a man who'd done something that had cost him something he was not going to discuss. He put a cup in front of her, sat down in the other chair. Cho's been running a second communication channel for 4 months, he said. His voice had no particular quality to it. Flat in the way that happened when you'd used up the emotional register on something privately and arrived at the conversation already empty. Encrypted relay through a logistics server in Busan. Low volume, high value. He's been selling forward positioning, where I'd be, when I'd be there, and what the security configuration would look like. Selena held her coffee cup with both hands, looked at him. 11 years, she said. 11 years. He didn't move. He has a daughter, 8 years old. His wife left 3 years ago. He's been carrying debt he didn't tell me about. A medical situation with his mother that cost more than he could manage. Something passed across his face. There and gone. I would have helped him if he'd come to me. You don't know that he knew that. No, Min-jae said. I don't. They sat in the quiet of the Seongdong apartment, with the city making its ambient sound through the sealed windows and the coffee cooling in their hands. What happens to him? She said. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. He's contained, he said. He'll be held until after the auction. What happens after, he set his cup down. Depends on what he knows, and whether he's told them everything or whether there's still something to protect. Selena looked at the Mirai project drawings on the desk, the east wall, the sightline that had to be preserved according to a survey grid 60 years old. The auction is in 9 days, she said. Yes, they're still planning it, even knowing you've been looking internally. They don't know what I've found, or how much. He picked up his coffee. They know I'm aware of a threat. They don't know I've found the channel. They'll proceed. Then you can use it. He looked at her. The channel, she said. Cho's channel. They don't know it's burned. You can use it to feed them what you want them to believe about the auction. Position, configuration. You can control what they think they know. A silence. That's correct, Min-jae said slowly. Which means you need someone who understands the positioning well enough to construct a credible false version. She looked at him. What does the auction security layout actually look like? Min-jae studied her face. You're not a security planner. No. I'm an architect. I understand spatial logic, load-bearing relationships, the way bodies move through designed environments, where sight lines converge and where they don't. I understand how to look at a floor plan and understand which positions are structurally dominant. She held his eyes. Show me the layout. Something shifted in his face. Not the thing she'd seen when he talked about Cho, not the careful affect of their early dinners. Something more direct, more present. If I show you this, he said, you're inside it, not adjacent. Inside. I'm already inside it. She said it without heat. Plain fact, same way she stated load-bearing specifications. I've been inside it since you came down those stairs, probably since my name showed up on Park Dae-won's RSVP list, and you recognized it from a magazine article 3 years ago. She paused. I'd like to know what I'm actually building. Min-jae reached into his jacket and removed a folded paper. He unfolded it on the desk beside her Mireille drawings. She leaned in. She had been looking at floor plans her entire professional life. Hotels, museums, commercial complexes, cultural centers, and she could read spatial architecture the way other people read text, the meaning assembling itself immediately from the marks on the page. The auction venue was a 4-story private club in Jongno-gu. She saw the main floor circulation, the secondary stairwell at the northwest corner, the service access that cut under the east wing, the rooftop terrace that would be the natural high ground position for anyone thinking about the building from the outside. She saw immediately 3 things. The first was where the security positions as currently planned would concentrate. The second was where a credible false version would place them that would look correct to anyone with basic tactical knowledge. The third was something else, something that made her go still over the page with her finger not quite touching it. This service corridor, she said, does it connect to the building across the street? Min-jae leaned in beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He looked at the mark she was indicating. Historically, yes. The buildings share a 1970s-era utility infrastructure. The connection was supposed to be sealed in the 2015 renovation. Supposed to be? He looked at her. If it wasn't fully sealed, she said, and they know about it, they don't need to come through your security at all. They don't need your position information to plan entry. They need it to plan timing. She looked up at him. The position data Cho was selling wasn't for an attack at the auction. It was for a window. They're going to come in through the utility corridor before the auction begins, position inside, and wait. The expression on Min-jae's face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. How certain are you? She looked back at the floor plan, traced the corridor with her eye, measured the spatial logic of it against what she understood about how people moved through buildings when they were trying not to be seen. The corridor runs beneath the east wing and exits into the service basement. The service basement has 2 points of contact with the main venue floor, the freight elevator and a fire door access to the kitchen staging area. If you're inside before security hardens the perimeter, those are invisible entry points. She looked at him. Architecturally, it's the only approach that doesn't require real-time position intelligence. The position data is cover. They wanted you looking at the surface while they used the bones. Min-jae straightened slowly. He was quiet for exactly the time it took him to process the dimensions of what she'd said. She could feel the quality of his silence, the weight of something very large being repositioned. Then he took out his phone. He made 3 calls in rapid succession. Korean, fast, and she didn't try to follow all of it, but she caught enough.
The corridor address, the 2015 renovation contractor, the instruction to verify the seal status tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. When he finished, he stood with the phone in his hand and looked at her with an expression she did not have clean language for. "You may have just changed the entire shape of this," he said. "I read buildings." She heard her own voice doing the thing it did when she was running on pure function, emotion filed somewhere behind the work. "It's the only thing I've always known how to do." He nodded slowly. And then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his jaw changed. A micro-expression she'd learned in the past week to read as the body's automatic response to a specific category of bad news, the kind that arrived with a name attached. He answered, listened for 11 seconds. "Where?" A pause. "Don't move him, I'm coming." He hung up. She was already watching his face, and what she saw there was not the controlled affect, and not the unguarded expression from a moment ago, but something older and colder than either of those, the thing that lived underneath the other things. "Cho," he said. "He's gone." "Gone how?" The room he was held in. The guard outside was found unconscious. Min-jae was already moving toward his jacket. Cho was extracted. Someone came for him. He looked at her directly. "Which means Baekdo knows we have him. Which means they know the channel is burned." He paused with his jacket half on. "Which means they've already changed the plan." Selena stood up. "The auction," she said. 9 days becomes, He checked his watch. Less than 9 days. They'll accelerate. They've lost their inside information. They've lost the element we didn't know we knew about. And now they know we've been looking. He held her gaze. "They're going to move before we're ready." She stood in the center of the Seongdong apartment with the floor plan on the desk and the Mirai drawings beside it, and the coffee going cold, and the city outside the sealed windows, and the accumulated weight of the last 3 weeks pressing down on the specific point where her spine met the back of her skull. She had come to Seoul to disappear. She had come to this apartment to stay safe. She had come to this conversation meaning to be helpful in a contained architectural way, and hand something useful to a man who had the apparatus to handle the rest. None of that was the shape of things anymore. "What do you need from me?" she said. Min-jae looked at her for a moment that had too much in it to unpack. "The utility corridor," he said. "I need to know exactly what a complete verification of that seal would look like. And I need to know whether someone with construction access credentials could reopen it in under 6 hours without triggering a standard building inspection." Selena looked at the floor plan. She looked at her own hands. She thought about 3 years of careful invisibility. She thought about the east wall and the sightline from the 1968 survey grid and the specific discipline of building something that had to stand against the forces pressing on it from every direction. She thought about the word "Sar-hai" in the dark outside her window and the 11 seconds of Min-jae's phone call and the expression on his face when he said Cho was gone. She picked up the floor plan. "Get me the renovation contractor's original specifications," she said. "And someone who can drive me to Jongno-gu tonight. I need to look at the building in person." Min-jae made the call. Outside, Seoul was doing what it always did, moving, loud, indifferent, permanent, and somewhere in it, a man she'd once loved was in a room with people who had plans that had her face adjacent to their center, and the woman who'd spent 3 years learning to be small and invisible and safe was standing over a floor plan in a borrowed apartment deciding, with the quiet deliberation of someone laying a foundation, to be the building in Jongno-gu looked like what it was pretending to be. That was the thing about good architectural deception. It didn't announce itself. The private club occupied a 5-story limestone facade that had been standing in some form since the 1960s. Renovated twice, updated once in 2015 with the kind of money that made things look seamlessly unchanged. From the street it read as exactly what the sign said: a members' social club, dark wood and brass fittings visible through the ground floor windows, the entrance flanked by planters that had been placed with the studied casualness of a stage set. Unimportant, permanent, not worth looking at twice. Selena stood across the street in the cold at 11:40 at night and looked at it twice. The man Min-jae had sent with her was named Han, and he stood slightly behind her left shoulder with his hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing, which she'd come to understand was his complete personality. He'd driven her here in 12 minutes and had been present and useful and entirely silent the whole time. She appreciated that more than she would have expected. She had the renovation contractor's specifications on her phone, photographed pages from a 2014 file that one of Min Jae's people had pulled from a storage facility in Mapogu in under 2 hours, which told her something about the scope of the apparatus she was now inside. She'd read them in the car. The utility corridor seal was listed in the final punch list as complete, signed off by the site supervisor on November 14, 2015. A single line item: concrete infill and fire-rated boarding, both sides. Standard protocol. What was not in the specifications was a secondary access point she'd noticed in the 1974 building survey that the 2015 renovation appeared not to have referenced. A junction point 3 meters north of the primary seal location, where the corridor met a disused drainage channel that ran perpendicular. In 2015, someone sealing the corridor had sealed the corridor. They had sealed exactly what they were contracted to seal and nothing else. The drainage channel was not in their contract. She photographed the relevant section of her phone screen and sent it to Min Jae. His response came in 40 seconds. How certain? She looked at the building across the street, at the east wing profile. At the ground-level ventilation grating she could see near the foundation line, set slightly proud of the limestone face in the specific way of mid-century drainage infrastructure that had been painted over but not filled. The grating on the east face, ground level, third from the north end, she sent. That's the drainage channel exit point. If the junction seal was never done, that's how they come in. A pause of 90 seconds. How do we verify without tipping that we're looking? She thought about this, about what verification required, about whether there was a way to look at something that was underground and sealed behind someone else's construction without leaving the kind of evidence of inquiry that the wrong person, briefed by the right person, would recognize. I need to go inside, she sent. The club, the basement level. I need to see the east wall from the interior. That's not possible tonight. Is there a staff entrance? A longer pause. Yes. Is there someone on your payroll inside that building? The pause this time had a different texture. The overnight facilities manager. He's been ours for 2 years. Then it's possible tonight. She looked at Han. He was already looking at her with the expression of a man who had received instructions she hadn't heard. He says you go in, I stay outside, Han said. This was the most words he'd used consecutively since she'd met him. She crossed the street. The facilities manager was a small, precise man in his 50s named O, who met her at the staff entrance on the north alley side and communicated everything he needed to communicate about his feelings through the quality of his silence, which was different from Han's silence. Not neutral, specifically unhappy. He led her down 2 flights to the basement level without speaking and unlocked the east utility room and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. She went in. The east wall of the basement utility room was exactly where the renovation specifications said it should be. Concrete block, painted gray, the surface uneven in the way of walls that had been refinished over existing structure rather than replaced. She ran her hand along it from the northwest corner to the junction point her calculations had identified. The surface was cold and slightly damp in the way of below-grade walls in winter, and completely uniform until the last 18 inches. There. The texture changed. Almost nothing. A fraction of a degree in temperature. A density difference under her palm that she would not have felt if she hadn't been looking for it. She pressed with 3 fingers. The wall surface gave the smallest fraction. Not structural, not the give of hollow core construction, but the give of material that had been applied rather than built. Covering something rather than forming something. The drainage channel junction was never sealed. It had been boarded and painted and handed off to a contractor who'd signed a punch list and moved to the next job. And behind the boarding, the junction was open, and beyond the junction, the drainage channel ran to the disused corridor, and the corridor ran beneath the east wing and connected, somewhere under 2 city blocks, to a building that the Baek Do Syndicate had or would have or already had access to. She photographed the wall surface. She photographed her hand against it. She photographed the junction corner with the flash off, using the flashlight app at an angle that showed the texture differential in shadow relief. She sent all of it to Min Jae. She was back across the street and standing next to Han in the cold when her phone rang. "You found it," Min-jae said. "Yes." "How long to come through that way?" She thought about the corridor dimensions from the 1974 survey, about the drainage channel cross-section, about how bodies moved through constrained horizontal spaces. If you're not rushing and you know where you're going, 40 minutes from the far building to that basement wall. If you've practiced it, 25. She paused. They've practiced it. A silence. "Come back," he said. She came back. The next 6 days were the most precisely calibrated things Selena had ever been part of, and she had spent her career managing the construction of complicated things on compressed timelines with too many variables. This was different. The variables here had weapons. Min-jae worked the way she worked, methodically, without wasted motion, sleeping in blocks and eating functionally and never performing urgency because actual urgency didn't require performance. She watched him run the operation from the Yongsan room and the Seongdong apartment alternately, moving between them on no schedule she could predict, and she understood that the unpredictability was structural rather than accidental. They fed Cho's compromise channel a modified version of the auction security layout. Not a fabrication. Min-jae had been clear about this, almost fastidious. Too clean a lie gets recognized as a lie. The effective version is true in its texture and wrong in its specific geometry. The positions they transmitted were plausible, based on real security logic, wrong in the 3 ways that mattered most: the rooftop coverage window, the service elevator timing, and the internal response team's staging location. The drainage channel was not touched. Min-jae made that decision on the second day, and she watched him make it and understood why. Sealing it was information. Leaving it open was an invitation, and invitations gave you control over who walked through the door. On the 4th day, Adrian cross-checked out of the Joseon Palace Hotel. Min-jae told her over coffee in the Seongdong kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, the same way he told her most things. Directly, without preparation or cushioning, because he'd learned early that she processed better without it. "Where did he go?" she said. "Incheon, the development site, the casino project." She set down her cup. "He's embedded with them." "He has been for weeks. The gala," Min-jae's voice remained even, "was not an accident of timing. He came to Seoul with the arrangement already made. Whatever happened at the gala between you and him was personal, but his presence in Seoul was operational." She absorbed this. She thought about Adrian's face in the ballroom. The performed surprise at seeing her, which she'd read as genuine at the time because she'd expected genuine. The wine, that had been real. The rage behind it had been real. But, the calculation underneath the rage. Adrian had always been able to sustain 2 operating levels simultaneously. She'd thought it was emotional complexity once. Later, she'd understood it was simply compartmentalization, the specific talent of someone who had learned to keep their actual intentions in a room the rest of their behavior didn't access. "He's going to be there," she said. "The auction night." "Yes." "And he knows I'm connected to you now." "Yes." She looked at the window. The city was doing its morning assembly. The first buses, the early delivery trucks, the specific quality of Seoul light at 6:15 in winter, gray and flat, and not yet committed to the day. "Then I'm an asset to them," she said. "I'm not just adjacent. If they know I've been working with you, I'm something they can use. Leverage." Min-jae was quiet. "Min-jae?" "Yes," he said. "You're right." She turned from the window. "Were you going to tell me that?" "I was deciding how." He met her eyes without flinching. "I didn't want it to change your decision to stay." "It doesn't change my decision." She heard the steadiness in her own voice and was faintly surprised by it. "But I need to know the whole shape of what I'm in. Always." That was the condition. "Yes," he said. "I know." On the 6th day, the evening before the auction, Selena was working at the desk when the phone rang, and the number was not Min-jae's, and was not any number she knew. She looked at it for 2 rings. She answered. "Selena." Adrian's voice on the phone was different from the ballroom voice, different from the 3 years ago voice, quieter. stripped of the performance layers. What was left was something she recognized from the very early period, the voice he used when he was frightened and trying not to show it, which she'd once thought was vulnerability and later understood was just fear wearing a different costume. "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening," she said. Her voice came out flat. "What you're involved in, what Kang has put you in the middle of. You don't understand what these people are capable of. The Baekdo organization, the people running this operation. I've seen it, Selena. I'm telling you, whatever he's planning for tomorrow night, it's not going to work the way he thinks it will. And you're going to be... Why are you calling me?" A short silence. "Because I don't want you dead." She felt something move in her chest. Not the old thing, not the remnant of what she'd felt for him. That was gone so completely, she could only find its outline now, the negative space where it had been. This was different, the specific coldness of recognizing a technique she'd seen before, deployed before, in smaller ways in the daily architecture of the 3 years she'd spent in the same room as his calculations. "You're trying to move me," she said. "I'm trying to... You want me out of that building tomorrow night. You want me scared enough or convinced enough to pull back? Why?" Silence. "Adrian?" Her voice didn't rise. It went down. Lower, quieter, the register she'd found somewhere in the last 3 years that was below anger and below fear and was just the bedrock of herself. What was left when everything softer had been stripped off? "You burned me. You took 3 years of my work and my name and my future, and you built your career on the foundation of it, and then you ran. I rebuilt something out of nothing, and now you're calling me, the night before the thing you helped plan, and telling me you don't want me dead. Selena, I don't believe you, but here's the thing." She paused. "I'm going to be in that building tomorrow whether you call me or not. So if this was an attempt to remove a variable, make a note for whoever you're reporting to, it didn't work." She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hands for a moment and noticed that her hands were not shaking. 3 years ago they would have been shaking. She made a note of that, filed it, and called Min Jae. "Adrian just called me," she said when he picked up. "He tried to pull me back. He's worried about my presence specifically." A pause. "What does that tell you?" "They're planning to use me as leverage, and I'm more effective as leverage if I'm outside the building and reachable. If I'm inside, I'm either an obstacle or a complication." She paused. "They're going to try to take me before the event." The silence on Min Jae's end was 4 seconds and had weight. "I want you in the building tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight. Stay overnight in the venue. I'll have it arranged." "Okay," she said. She packed a bag in 11 minutes and Han drove her to Jongno-gu and she went through the staff entrance again. And oh, the facilities manager looked even less happy than the first time and led her to a small room on the 3rd floor that had a couch and a lamp and a window that looked onto the enclosed courtyard and did not have sight lines to the street. She didn't sleep. She lay on the couch and listened to the building and thought about spatial architecture and load-bearing points and the way structures communicated their own stress through the sounds they made, the settling, the wind against the facade, the way a building talked to you in the dark if you knew how to listen. Sometime around 2 in the morning, she heard the facility's entrance door. Not O. O had gone home at midnight. The door used a card reader, and she knew that because she'd noted the card reader on her first visit, had filed it the way she filed every access point, automatically, the professional habit of someone who thought in terms of how spaces were entered and exited. She got off the couch. She moved to the door of the small room and put her hand against it and listened. Footsteps on the basement stairs. Not one person, more than one. The cadence of people moving carefully but not carefully enough. The kind of careful that came from training rather than familiarity with the specific acoustic properties of this specific building. She had her phone. She was already pressing Minji's number. He picked up on the first ring. "I hear it," he said before she spoke. "We're already moving, don't..." And then the lights went out. All of them. The building going dark in one cut, not a breaker failure, not a gradual failure. A clean systemic cut that meant someone in the basement or outside it had accessed the main electrical supply and made a deliberate decision. In the complete dark, she could hear her own heartbeat, which was elevated and steady, and the footsteps which were now moving up the stairs. "Min Jae?" she said. 30 seconds, he said. Stay in the room. Brace the door. She braced the door. Her shoulder against the wood, her foot against the base, her back straight. Her weight distributed the way the body distributed weight when it understood at a cellular level that staying meant resisting, and resisting meant using everything you had. The footsteps reached the third floor. They stopped outside her door. A silence of about 4 seconds, then a voice she recognized, quiet, pleasant, stripped of everything that had ever made it seem human. Selena, Adrian said, don't make this complicated. She said nothing. We just need you to come with us. That's all this is. You'll be fine. Think of it as a negotiation position. Kang backs down, you go home. That's the entire plan. A pause. You know me. You know I don't want to hurt you. I know exactly what you want, she said. Her voice came through the door, clear and even. And I know exactly what you're capable of. They're not the same thing. A silence. Then something hit the door. Not the shoulder hit of a single person. The mechanical impact of something applied to the door handle, the specific sound of hardware being defeated, and she leaned harder and felt the door shift against her weight and knew she had maybe 45 seconds before the resistance calculus stopped working in her favor. The window. She looked at it in the dark. Third floor. The courtyard below. She'd measured it when she arrived. A habit, the way she measured everything. 12 feet of drop to the courtyard surface, which was stone, which would be bad for ankles. But the courtyard had a maintenance structure on the south side. A low roof over the electrical access housing. She'd noted it on the first visit without knowing why she was noting it, the automatic inventory of someone who thought in terms of structural alternatives. The door hit again. Harder. The frame cracked at the top corner. She crossed to the window. Her hands found the latch in the dark by feel. Old casement design, single lever, the kind she'd specified in renovation work 100 times. She flipped it. Pushed the window. Cold air hit her face. Below, in the courtyard, she could see nothing, but she could hear it. The sounds coming from the south side of the building that were not the city's ambient sound, that were too purposeful, too directional. The door came off the frame. She went out the window. The maintenance roof was lower than 12 feet and she hit it wrong. Left foot, right knee, catching the edge, the impact traveling up through her thigh and into her hip with the bright declarative pain of collision. Not broken, but close. The joints protest sharp and immediate. She rolled. The roof surface was cold metal, and she came off the far edge and dropped the last 4 feet to the courtyard stone and came down hard on both feet, and the shock ran up through her whole body, and she was running before the pain finished registering. The courtyard gate was iron, latched from outside. She hit it at speed, and the impact was all shoulder, and the latch gave cheap hardware, internal mechanism, the gate swinging outward, and she was in the alley, running north, the cold air cutting her lungs, the hip telling her loudly about the maintenance roof in a language she was currently not accepting. She heard them behind her. She ran. The alley was narrow and turned twice, and she took both turns because turns were cover and cover was survival, and she'd spent 3 years developing a very specific relationship with survival. Behind her, the footsteps were fast and organized, more than one person, and she could hear the separation between them and understand from the gap in the sound, that they'd split, one behind her and one cutting parallel, trying to funnel her toward the alley's end where it met the main road. She stopped at the second turn, pressed into the recess of a locked service door, made herself flat, made herself still. The footstep behind her reached the first turn, paused. She heard the pause, the decision point, the half-second of directional uncertainty, and then moved forward past her position, committing to the alley's continuation. She went back the way she'd come, out of the alley's south end, onto the cross street, and there were headlights swinging around the corner, and her whole body locked up for the 2 seconds it took her to process that the car was the Genesis G90, and Han was in the driver's seat, and the rear door was already open. She got in. The door closed. The car moved. She sat in the back seat with her hip on fire and her lungs running on debt, and her hands finally trembling, and looked out the dark window at Jongno-gu going past. "Min-jae?" she said. Han handed a phone back over his shoulder. Min-jae's voice came through before she could speak. I see you on the tracker. Are you hurt? Hip, not serious, she breathed. Breathed again. They were in the building. Adrian was with them. They came through the drainage channel, Minji. They came through it tonight, not tomorrow. They changed the timeline again. I know. His voice was controlled, but below the control there was something running hot. The auction. They've moved it up. It's not tomorrow evening. It's tonight. They've changed to a secondary venue. She stared at the back of Han's headrest. What secondary venue? The Sky Meridian Tower, north of the river. Development project, unfinished. The top 4 floors are empty. They've pulled the principals in early, and they're using the construction site as the location. No public profile, no registered event, no security hardening they have to defeat because there is no security. A pause. It's already in motion. The transfer, the financial extraction, it's being set up right now. Where are you? 20 minutes from the tower. I have people in position, but his voice stopped for the fraction of a second that she'd learned to read as the thing he was deciding whether to tell her. They have Cho. They've had him since the extraction. And Cho knows the full financial architecture. If he's already talked, he's talked, she said. Flat, certain. The same voice she used for load calculations. They wouldn't have moved this fast if he hadn't talked. They have everything. A silence. Yes, Min-jae said. I think so too. She looked at Han. Where is the Sky Meridian Tower? Han glanced back at her in the mirror. 23 minutes north, he said. She thought about the floor plan of a building she'd never seen, about the logic of an unfinished construction site as a venue for something that needed to happen fast and leave no record. She thought about the financial architecture, the encrypted account infrastructure Min-jae had described, the thing that was the actual foundation of everything, more important than the buildings and the people and the public legitimacy. She thought about what it would look like to lose that and what rebuilding from that loss would cost, and whether there was a version of tonight in which Min-jae came out of the Sky Meridian Tower with the infrastructure intact. There was one version, one narrow, specific version. Drive, she said to Han. She picked up Min-jae's phone. The encrypted account infrastructure, the access credentials. How are they stored? A physical device, hardware token plus biometric, both required. Where is the device? A pause that told her the answer before he said it. On me, Min-jae said. Then they need you there to complete the transfer. Alive. They need your biometric. She felt the shape of it assembling itself from the available facts the way a structural load diagram assembled itself from specifications. Inevitable, the logic of physics. They're not planning to kill you at the tower. They're planning to use you at the tower and kill you after. A silence that went on long enough for her to hear him breathing. Yes, he said. Then you can't go in first. You go in last. She was running through it, the spatial logic, the sequence. You need someone inside before you. Someone who can get to their communications infrastructure and cut their ability to transmit the extracted data, because even if they complete the biometric transfer, they still need a clean transmission window to get the funds out of your network. If the transmission is interrupted or the authentication loop is broken at the right moment, the entire extraction fails and the data routes back to a recovery address I've built into the architecture, Min-jae said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not warm, something more specific, like recognition. I know that building type, she said. Construction phase development, North River District. I've worked 3 projects with that profile. I know how they stage the floors. I know where the temporary communications infrastructure would be set up in an unfinished top floor space. And I have something they don't know I have. What? She thought about the casino documents, about 63 to 71, about the server room requirements she'd read as standard IT infrastructure and filed and not yet fully excavated. Those pages they seeded in the casino file, she said. I read them, all of them. I know the routing architecture for their transmission protocol. I know which frequency band they use for their encrypted relay. She paused. I know how to break it. The silence was long enough that she checked the phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. Selena. His voice had come down to the quiet register she associated with his most serious communications. If you go into that building before I do, and they recognize you, they already tried to take me tonight, she said. They know I'm a complication either way. The difference is whether I'm a complication outside that building or inside it. She looked at the dark city going past the window. I'm better inside. She heard him exhale. There's a construction access on the east face, he said. Temporary lift, exterior mounted. It'll be unmonitored because they don't know we know the venue. 4th floor from the top is where they'll stage. It's the only level with temporary power run in. A pause. Han will take you to the east face. I'll come in from the north in 15 minutes. 15 minutes, she said. If anything changes... 15 minutes, Min-jae. She passed the phone back to Han. She looked at her hands. They had stopped trembling. Han swung the Genesis north across the river, and the Sky Meridian Tower came into view ahead of them. A construction crane visible against the city-lit sky. The upper floors dark, except for what she could now see were small, moving lights on the 4th floor from the top. Flashlights or work lights. The specific warm color of temporary construction power. She looked at it and saw a building. Read it the way she always read buildings. The access points, the load-bearing geometry, the sight lines, the spaces between the lit windows where the structure was making its own decisions about how to stand against everything pressing on it. Stop at the east face, she said. Han stopped. She got out of the car. The construction lift was exactly where Min-jae said it would be. Exterior mounted, temporary, the kind of platform lift used for material transport on active builds. She crossed the site perimeter at the gap in the hoarding where the contractor vehicle access was. Her hip registering every step in specific and precise terms she categorized as manageable, and she reached the lift platform and looked up at the building above her. 40 floors. The top 4 dark except for those moving lights. She pressed the lift control and felt the platform shudder under her feet and begin to rise, and the city spread out below her as she ascended. Seoul in winter, cold and lit and immense and permanent, doing its business without reference to what was happening on the exterior of this particular unfinished building on this particular night, which was appropriate. Cities were like that. They didn't adjust for the small dramas happening inside them. They just continued. The lift reached the 37th floor and stopped at the construction hoarding level, and she stepped off onto bare concrete and could hear, from 2 floors above, the sounds of people who were nearly finished with something and were moving with the specific efficiency of people who planned to be elsewhere very soon. She had a phone. She had the frequency information from Cho's transmission architecture encoded in her memory, the way she encoded structural specifications, precisely, retainably, without redundancy. She had 14 minutes. She moved to the temporary cable run that snaked across the floor toward the stairwell, thick orange construction cord, the kind used to power work lights and portable equipment on active builds, and followed it toward the junction box mounted against the north wall where the temporary power distribution split between floors. The junction box was padlocked, standard construction padlock, the same brand she'd specified on a dozen projects, keyed identically across a contractor's inventory because it was cheaper to manage 1 key than 20. She looked around the floor, found the contractor's materials locker bolted to the east wall. Open. The build team had been in and out and hadn't locked it on the last pass. She went through it in 30 seconds and found the contractor's keyring on a hook inside the door, where contractors always kept the keyring. She unlocked the junction box, looked at the distribution panel inside, read the layout the way she read everything, the logic of it, where the power went, which breaker controlled which branch, the temporary communications relay she could see mounted on the panel's secondary bus, a small cellular repeater device that she recognized from the frequency specifications in the Becto documents. She identified the relay. She had 9 minutes. From 2 floors above, she heard Adrian Cross's voice carrying down the stairwell, clipped and urgent, giving instructions to someone she couldn't see. She had 8 minutes and the junction box open in front of her and the relay unit 3 inches from her hand and her hip telling her about the maintenance roof, in terms she was now fully refusing to accept, and the lights of Seoul spread out through the open construction hoarding on the east face like a circuit board lit from below, enormous and intricate and indifferent to the specific small weight of one woman's hands moving towards her. Fingers closed around the relay unit and pulled. It didn't come free cleanly. Nothing on a construction site came free cleanly. Everything was torqued down 1 degree past necessary by workers who'd learned that things vibrated loose over time and compensated for it in advance. She pulled harder. The mounting bracket flexed, the screw heads groaning against the panel housing, and she braced her forearm against the junction box frame and used the leverage, and the relay came away from the secondary bus with the sound of stressed metal and a small shower of sparks that hit her wrist, and she didn't move away from them because there wasn't time to move away from things. The relay unit was in her hand, small, black, the size of a thick paperback, warm from running. She looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she dropped it on the concrete floor and put her boot through it. The casing cracked on the first impact. She hit it again, harder, the heel of her boot finding the circuit board housing and compressing it, the internal components giving way with a series of small mechanical failures that she felt through the sole of her boot as a kind of ugly satisfaction. She hit it a third time until the LED indicator that had been green was dark and stayed dark. From 2 floors above, someone shouted. Not words she could parse, volume without content, the specific register of someone who'd been watching a status indicator and just watched it change from green to nothing. She heard running, heard more voices, the rapid Korean of people recalibrating. She closed the junction box, stepped back from the cable run, looked at the stairwell access door 6 meters to her left. 8 minutes had become 4 minutes. She moved to the east face opening and looked down. The construction lift was there, platform level, where she'd left it. Below it, at the site perimeter, she could see the Genesis G90 and Han standing beside it with his jacket open and both hands visible, and something in his posture that she read as readiness for something specific. She also saw, coming fast from the north access road, 3 vehicles with their lights off. Min-jae. She was already at the stairwell door when it opened from inside. The man who came through it first was not someone she knew. Late 30s, heavy, moving fast with the momentum of someone descending stairs at speed and not expecting resistance at the door. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and there was a half-second of mutual recalibration before he grabbed for her left arm. She gave him the arm. It was the least elegant decision she'd ever made and the most functional. She let him close his hand around her forearm and used the established grip as an axis point, pivoting hard left and bringing her right elbow up into his chin with the full rotation of her body behind it, the way a structural impact worked, all the force delivered to the smallest possible contact point. His head snapped back. His grip didn't release, but his weight shifted backward, and she pulled forward and the grip broke and he went into the doorframe and she was past him and running for the lift. Her hip had a specific and declarative opinion about running that she continued to not accept. She hit the lift platform at speed and stabbed the down control and felt the platform shudder and begin to descend, and looked up and saw the man she'd elbowed standing in the east face opening, looking down at her with blood on his chin and an expression that was working through several stages of response simultaneously. He didn't follow. The lift descended. She watched the floors go past, dark concrete and rebar, and the industrial archaeology of a building in the process of becoming, and held the platform rail with both hands, and felt her heartbeat in her wrists, and her hip, and her right elbow, where the impact had traveled back up, and the inside of her lungs, where the cold air was doing unkind things. The platform reached ground level. She stepped off. Han was already moving toward her, and behind him the 3 vehicles from the north road had entered the site perimeter through the contractor access, and were positioned in a triangle pattern around the tower's base that told her Min-jae had planned the geometry of this before he arrived, had looked at a site plan, and decided where to place the angles of approach. Min-jae was out of the lead vehicle before it fully stopped. He crossed the distance between them at a pace that was not quite running, controlled, fast, the walk of someone covering ground while maintaining the appearance of not needing to. He looked at her with those dark eyes, doing a rapid inventory she could feel the thoroughness of. "The relay," she said. "We saw the indicator drop." His voice was doing the controlled thing, but underneath it was the running hot thing, and she could hear both. His hand came up and almost touched her face and stopped an inch from her jaw, hovering, and she understood from the stop that he'd caught himself. The checking impulse versus the operational context, and his operational habit winning. "Did you boot?" she said. Something moved in his face. "The transmission window is closed," she said. Whatever they managed before I pulled the relay, it's incomplete. If your recovery architecture is what you described, the partial transmission should route back. It will. His eyes hadn't moved from her face. Are you hurt? Elbow, hip, both manageable. She looked at the tower above them. They know the relay is down. They know we're here. They have, she calculated, 10 minutes before the transfer authentication loop expires and the extraction attempt fails entirely. They're going to try to move. I know, Min-jae said. And then, to the men behind him, he gave a series of instructions in Korean that she didn't follow completely but understood in its architecture. Positions, approaches, the specific vocabulary of people who had done this kind of thing before and had a shared language for it. She caught one word. Adrian. She caught Min-jae's eye. He's in the building, she said. Yes. He needs to answer for... He will. Min-jae looked at her with the full weight of his attention. But not by you chasing him into a construction site in the dark. That's not your job tonight. She looked at the tower. She thought about the 9-minute window, about the relay unit in pieces on the 37th floor, about the financial architecture rerouting itself through the recovery address Min-jae had built in against exactly this kind of attempt, about the fact that the work she'd come here to do was done. She'd done it with a junction box and a contractor's keyring and the institutional knowledge of how construction sites organize their temporary power infrastructure, which was possibly the least cinematic version of saving someone's life that had ever occurred. She looked back at Min-jae. Go, she said. He held her eyes for one more second. Then he went. She stood at the base of the Sky Meridian Tower and watched his people move into the building and listened to Seoul doing its permanent business around the perimeter of the site and held her right elbow with her left hand and breathed. The next 40 minutes were the longest she'd spent stationary since the night the police came to her apartment in New York, which was a different kind of waiting but had the same specific texture. The waiting of someone who'd done everything they could do and was now subject to the results of other people doing things she couldn't see or control. She'd never been good at that kind of waiting. She stood and did it anyway because there was nothing else. Han stood nearby, didn't speak. She appreciated that. She heard gunfire twice, both times brief, not the sustained exchange of an equal fight, but the sharp, terminal punctuation of a situation that had resolved itself quickly. She tracked the sound to the upper floors and stood with her hand on the lift control that she had not pressed and would not press, and breathed through the information that the sounds gave her, and waited. The third sound was different. A window, glass under pressure, from high up, the specific frequency of tempered construction glass making a decision about its own integrity. She looked up and saw nothing useful in the dark. Then her phone rang. Min-jae's number. It's done, he said. She exhaled. It came out of her as something larger than a breath. The release of something that had been compressed for days, weeks, the accumulated weight of forward motion under constant threat finally encountering the wall it had been heading for. The extraction failed, he said. The recovery routing completed. Everything's back where it should be. We have the Baekdo principles in the building. We have... A brief pause. Cho. She heard something in that pause, the weight of 11 years on 2 letters. And Adrian, she said. A silence. He tried to go off the roof, Min-jae said. She closed her eyes for a moment. He's alive, Min-jae said. He's not going anywhere. She opened her eyes, looked at the city. I want to see him. A pause longer than the previous ones. Selena, I want to see him. Her voice was quiet and completely certain. That's not negotiable. The silence resolved. 15th floor, north stairwell. She took the lift. The 15th floor was framed but not walled, open concrete columns, and the city visible through the unglazed window openings on all sides, the wind coming through unobstructed and cold, the floor surface raw concrete with construction debris pushed to the perimeter. Work lights on temporary stands threw harsh white light in overlapping circles that left the columns casting multiple shadows. It smelled like concrete dust in the cold and something metallic that she identified and filed and moved past. Adrian was sitting on the floor with his back against a column and his wrists zip-tied in front of him. Two of Min-jae's men stood at a distance that was close enough to be definitive and far enough to not be present. Adrian's tuxedo. Not the Phoenix Foundation tuxedo, a different one, the same general category of expensive fabric, was torn at the shoulder and there was blood on his collar from somewhere on his face that she couldn't see clearly in this light. His hair was disordered. He looked like a version of himself with the surface removed, and underneath the surface was something she'd never seen on him clearly because it had always been wrapped in the other things. He looked afraid, not performing fear, not deploying vulnerability as a tactic, which she'd seen him do many times. Actually afraid, the animal version, the kind that showed in the body before the brain had a chance to route it through presentation. He looked up when she approached. Something moved across his face. Not relief. Too complicated for relief. The expression of a man encountering the one person in the world whose opinion of him he'd spent years pretending he didn't care about. She stood in front of him and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The wind came through the unglazed openings. The city moved around the building. "You framed me," she said. Not an accusation. A statement. Plain, structural, the way she might state the dimensions of a load-bearing wall to a contractor who'd asked why it couldn't be moved. Adrian looked at the floor between his zip-tied hands. His jaw worked slightly. "The Meridian pitch," she said. "You took 3 years of my work. You removed my name. You built the fraud case from documents you generated and attributed to me, and you sat across from me in that mediation room and looked me in the eye while I signed the settlement that cleared you and contained me." She paused. "I need you to say it. Not for me. Not for whatever this is. Just because it needs to be said by the person who did it." Adrian looked up at her. His face was doing the work of several competing impulses simultaneously. The residual reflex toward denial, the performance habit of years, the calculation about what confession cost him in this specific situation. She watched all of it happen and felt nothing about it except the patience of someone who had stopped needing things to resolve quickly. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet, stripped down, the most unadorned thing she'd ever heard him say. "All of it," she said. He held her eyes, his jaw tightened. "All of it," he said. "The Meridian documentation, the attribution, the fraud case, all of it." She stood with the wind coming through the open building and Seoul spread out in every direction and the confession in the air between them, which was smaller than she'd expected. Not smaller than it deserved. It deserved to be enormous. It had taken 3 years of her life and the version of herself she'd been before it, and those things were real and their cost was real. But the confession itself was small. A few words. The truth had always been small. It was the lies that were architecturally complex, that required support structures and maintenance and the constant effort of holding multiple false walls upright simultaneously. The truth was just, yes, all of it. The Meridian documentation. "Why?" she said. Adrian looked at the floor again. "The committee trusted your instincts more than mine. I'd been at Halcyon longer. I'd worked the relationship longer. The pitch was supposed to be mine." He stopped. Started again. "I needed it to be mine." "You needed it to be yours, so you made it yours." "Yes." She looked at him. At this man, she'd spent 3 years mythologizing into a monster because monsters were easier to carry than the truth, which was that he was ordinary, greedy, cowardly, self-serving in the specific, unimaginative way of people who'd never developed the capacity to value anything that didn't immediately serve their own reflection back to them. Not a monster. An ordinary man who'd done a monstrous thing because he was afraid of being ordinary without her work to stand on. "You know what the worst part is," she said. He didn't answer. "The Meridian pitch was going to be the best thing either of us ever did," she said. "The load distribution on the south facade alone, what I was doing with the sightline integration and the structural cantilever at the 4th level, it was going to be referenced for 20 years. It was going to matter." She heard her own voice, and it was not angry. It was tired in a specific, clean way. The tiredness that came after the anger had burned through and left the actual thing, which was grief. "And you turned it into a fraud case and a settlement and 3 years of both of us producing smaller work than we were capable of." Adrian looked at her with his face open in a way she'd never seen it. "I know," he said. "It came out wrecked, not performed.
I know what I did. Then you understand why I'm not angry at you anymore, she said. I was, for a long time. But you can't sustain anger at someone for being exactly what they always were. I just didn't see it clearly enough, early enough. She looked at him. That's my failure. I own it, and I'm done with it. She turned away. Selena, you're going to answer for the Baekdo operation, she said without turning back. The Korean authorities and at least 2 international bodies have been given the financial documentation. That's not my doing. That was in motion before tonight, but the Meridian fraud is also documented now. My attorney in New York has been holding a file for 8 months. I didn't know if I'd ever use it. Now I know. She heard him exhale, the sound of a man receiving a sentence he'd always known was waiting. She walked to the stairwell. She didn't look back. Min-jae was waiting on the ground floor, standing outside the vehicle with his hands loose at his sides and the controlled expression in place but worn differently now. Thinner, the control more visible because the thing underneath it was more visible. He looked at her when she came out of the building, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. That had too many layers to collapse into language immediately. His right hand had a cut across the knuckles. She looked at it. Don't ask, he said. I wasn't going to, she said. He almost smiled. The almost was enough. The authentication loop expired 6 minutes ago, he said. The extraction is completely voided. The recovery routing is confirmed complete. Everything that was taken is back. He looked at her steadily. What you did with the relay, that was the difference. She thought about the junction box, the contractor's keyring, the boot through the circuit board. It was just reading the building, she said. No, he said. It wasn't just that. She looked at the Sky Meridian Tower above them, at the construction crane against the sky, at the top 4 floors where the temporary work lights were still burning, lit up in the dark like an incomplete thought that someone had left on. What happens now? She said. Min-jae considered the question without hurrying it. The Baekdo principals in that building are going to spend a significant amount of time answering questions from people whose job it is to ask them. The financial documentation that was transmitted before you cut the relay, the partial data, routes to a recovery protocol that flags the attempt with 3 jurisdictions automatically. That creates a paper trail that goes back to the Singapore Shell Company, which goes back to the Incheon development account, which goes back to things that certain organizations have been wanting to demonstrate for years. He paused. Adrian Cross's involvement in both the Baekdo operation and the original fraud case in New York is documented in material that will be with the relevant authorities before morning. And Cho, she said. The control in Min-jae's face worked harder for a moment. Cho has a daughter, he said, 8 years old. The debt that pushed him toward this, his mother's medical costs, is something I should have known about. I didn't know because he didn't come to me, and he didn't come to me because... He stopped. Because I built something that people were afraid to bring problems to. That's a structural failure. It belongs to me. She looked at him. That's a strange thing for a man in your position to say, she said. It's accurate. What will happen to him? Min-jae looked at the tower. He'll answer for what he did. The consequences will be real. A pause. His daughter won't suffer for them. That I can control. Selena looked at the city, at the distance between the cruelty of what Cho had done and the cruelty of what had been done to Cho first. The financial pressure, the isolation, the sense that there was no one to ask. She didn't excuse it. She understood it, which was different and heavier. I want to go somewhere warm, she said. Min-jae looked at her with the dark eyes and the expression that was now fully present, the internal distance gone. Whatever had been maintained between him and the surface of things during the operation was done being maintained. I know a place, he said. The place was a restaurant in Insadong that was open until 4 in the morning and served jigai that arrived in stone pots still actively boiling and had wooden tables and yellowed lighting and music playing too low to identify. They sat at a table in the back corner, and she wrapped both hands around the stone pot and let the heat move into her palms and her wrists. And she ate and didn't think about what she'd eaten in 3 days because the question was not currently important.
Min-jae ate across from her and watched her with a quality of attention that she'd stopped being uncomfortable about somewhere in the last 2 weeks. The full presence way he had, the way of a person who'd learned that things disappeared and so paid attention to them while they were here. She put down her spoon. "My attorney is going to file the Meridian fraud documents this week," she said. "The case goes active. It'll be public. My name comes back," she paused, "attached to a 3-year-old fraud allegation, even if the fraud was his." "Your name comes back," Min-jae said, "as the person who was defrauded. That's different. Legally, not always publicly." "No," he said. "Not always publicly." He looked at her. "What do you want it to look like?" She thought about the east wall, about the sightline from the 1968 survey grid, about the specific discipline of building something that had to stand against the forces pressing on it from every direction and still be, at the end of the work, something worth looking at. "I want to build something," she said, "a real project, not restaurant interiors. I'm not dismissing Park Daewon's projects. They mattered. They kept me functional. But I want something that pushes structurally, something that has to solve a real problem." She looked at her hands on the table. "The Meridian pitch, the cantilever integration on the south facade. I've been refining the approach in my head for 3 years. The problem was never solved. I want to solve it." Min-jae was quiet. "The Sky Meridian Tower," he said. She looked up. "It's currently without an architect," he said carefully. "The development group contracted the structural shell and ran into permit complications, and the original design firm withdrew 6 months ago. The project has been dormant." He held her eyes. "The top 8 floors are uncommissioned. The brief calls for a mixed-use cultural and commercial space with specific public access requirements." A pause. "The south facade has a sightline issue with the heritage corridor that the original firm couldn't resolve." Selena looked at him. A slow, real smile started on her face. Not the careful version, not the professional warmth she'd been deploying since New York. The actual one, which showed in the corners of her eyes before it reached her mouth and which she'd forgotten she still had access to. "You're offering me a project," she said. "I'm identifying a building with an unresolved structural problem," he said, "and a designer whose specific expertise addresses exactly that kind of problem. That's still offering me a project." "Yes," he said, and waited. She looked at him across the table in the yellow light of the Insadong restaurant with the jigai cooling in the stone pot and the city outside the window doing its permanent business, and thought about the shape of what this was and what it might become, and whether she was the person who could hold both things simultaneously. The clarity she'd built in 3 years of careful solitude and the specific warmth of being seen by someone who had his own damage and knew it and wasn't performing its absence. She thought about the south facade, about the cantilever, about the sightline problem and the structural approach she'd been refining in her head in the dark hours for 3 years, which had no building attached to it yet, which had been waiting with the patience of a solution that knew it was correct and only needed the right question to answer. "Send me the brief," she said. He reached into his jacket and put a folded envelope on the table in front of her. She looked at it, looked at him. "You had that on you," she said. "I've had it on me for 2 weeks," he said. She picked up the envelope, held it, looked at him across the table with the full knowledge of what he was and what he'd done and who he'd been before she knew him and the specific gravity of that knowledge, which was real and not reducible, and which she was choosing to carry with eyes open. "Okay," she said. He looked at her, that fractional, not quite smile. "Okay," he said. She opened the envelope. Opened the 6 months later on a Thursday in late autumn, with the first cold front of the season coming in off the Yellow Sea and the ginkgo trees on Sejong-daero burning yellow against the gray sky, Selena Vale stood on the temporary observation platform at the 42nd floor of the Sky Meridian Tower and looked at the south facade. The cantilever was right. She'd known it was right on paper and in the model and in the 300-page structural analysis her engineer had gone through twice. But knowing it on paper and standing on steel framing with the city 400 feet below you and the cantilever extending 12 meters into open air above the Heritage Corridor sight line, carrying its load through a tension system she'd spent 3 years developing in the back of her mind while doing other work, That was different. You couldn't fully know a building until you were inside it with it, until you could feel the logic of the structure through your feet and your hands and the specific quality of the air moving around it. The cantilever was right. The sight line was preserved. The load distribution was exactly what she'd calculated. She stood there for a long time. Her phone buzzed. Dinner tonight. The Insadong place. 7 o'clock. A pause in the message thread. Then, I have something to tell you. She looked at that last line, felt the specific texture of it. Not ominous, she'd learned his register well enough to read the texture. Something else. She typed back, good something or complicated something? His response came in 10 seconds. Both. She looked at the city. At Seoul spread out in every direction, permanent and loud and entirely indifferent to the specific small weight of one woman standing on a cantilever she'd been building in her head for 3 years. She'd come here to disappear. She had, for a while. And then she'd been seen. By the wrong person first, in the worst way, in front of 200 witnesses with red wine running down a borrowed silver dress. And then, on a staircase, by someone who'd come down the stairs slowly because he had nowhere urgent to be and enough stillness inside him to recognize something specific in the middle of a room full of approximate shapes. She thought about the woman in the taxi window, the one with shadows under her eyes, and the jaw set too tight and 3 years of survival written in every line of her posture. She tried to find her now, in the reflection from the construction glass panel to her left, and couldn't quite locate her. That woman was not gone. Selena knew better than to think in those terms. Knew that the things that happened to you became structural. They didn't disappear. They became part of the load the building had to carry. She was still in there. She would always be in there. But she was no longer the only person in the reflection. The Adrian Cross fraud case had gone public 4 months ago. 3 weeks of business press, 2 television segments, a long piece in a New York architecture journal that had been thorough and accurate and had quoted the Meridian pitch specifications directly, attributing them correctly. The settlement had been vacated. Halcyon Group had sent a letter that she'd read once and filed without response because the letter was for their benefit, not hers, and she had enough now that she could afford to know the difference. Adrian was in a process that would take years and cost him everything that was costable, and she thought about him sometimes. Not often, not with the intensity of the old rage or the old grief, but sometimes. And when she did, she thought about what he'd said in that 15th floor darkness. I know what I did. The most honest thing she'd heard from him in years of knowing him, and it had come out of him stripped and quiet, and she'd believed it, and believing it had been the last thing she'd needed to do where he was concerned. The cantilever held its 12 meters of extension against the autumn wind without commentary. She put her phone in her pocket. She took one more look at the south facade, at the sightline threading cleanly through the heritage corridor below, preserved, intact, the survey grid from 1968 still legible in the geometry of the modern structure above it, the old city and the new one in conversation rather than conflict, which was the only kind of architecture she'd ever wanted to make. And then she turned and went back inside to finish the work. At 7 o'clock, she was at the Insadong restaurant. Min Jae was already there. Same table, same quality of waiting, patient, present, not performing anything. He had a glass of soju he hadn't touched, and the thing he wanted to tell her was written in his face before she sat down, in the way of a person who'd spent so long not showing things that when he chose to, it was very clear. She sat down across from him. She looked at him. Tell me, she said. He told her. It was complicated. It was both things he'd said in the message. She listened, and it cost her something. Not the thing she'd been afraid of, not the version where the new thing became the old thing, not the revelation that undid the foundation, but something real, something that required the kind of honesty she'd demanded from him and that he'd been, as promised, consistent about delivering. A complication from the past. Something that could not be unchanged. Something that she would have to decide whether she could stand alongside with full knowledge, eyes open. She sat with it for a long moment. The jigai arrived in the stone pot, still boiling. She wrapped both hands around it. Tell me the rest, she said. He told her the rest. She listened to all of it. The yellow light in the restaurant didn't change. The music played too low to identify. Outside, Seoul moved in its permanent way,
indifferent and constant and lit up like a circuit board seen from above. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. He looked at her. "I'm also not pretending this is simple," she said. "It's not. It's going to be not simple." She picked up her spoon. "But I've been building things on complicated foundations my whole career, and I've learned that complicated doesn't mean wrong. It just means the engineering has to be better." She looked at him. "So that's what we do. Better engineering." Something settled in his face. Not relief. Something stiller than relief. The expression of a man who'd been carrying a thing for a long time and had just put it down in a place where it could be looked at together rather than alone. "You're an architect," he said. "I know," she said. "It's the only thing I've ever known how to be." She ate. He ate. The city outside did what it always did, which was everything and nothing, the perpetual motion of a place that did not wait for individual people to resolve their individual waits before continuing. Selena looked at the restaurant's far wall. Plain plaster, cracked slightly at the ceiling line, the kind of crack that spoke to settling, to the slow, patient work of a building adjusting to its own load, and thought about the cantilever and the south facade and the sight line preserved through the heritage corridor. She thought about the borrowed silver dress and the marble floor and the wine. She thought about a black silk handkerchief. She thought about the woman in the taxi window who had not known, on that rain-hammered night 3 years into her own disappearance, that she was 8 months away from standing on a cantilever 42 floors above a city that had been trying to show her, the whole time, that it did not need you to matter in order to offer you the materials to build something that did. She finished her G-guy. She put down the spoon. Outside, Seoul burned cold and gold and permanent under a sky that was clear for the first time in weeks, the yellow sea cold front having blown the clouds east and left the city raw and lit and exactly what it always was, merciless and generous in the same breath, the way all cities were if you stayed long enough to learn their second language. Selena Vale looked at the man across the table from her and felt, without sentimentality and without the softening that sentimentality provided, the full specific weight of where she was, what she'd come through, what it had cost, what remained. What remained was considerable. She picked up her glass. "To complicated foundations," she said. Min-jae picked up his. "And better engineering," he said. They drank. The restaurant kept its yellow light. The city kept its permanent motion. And the woman who had once been told she should stay buried sat in the warm back corner of a place that didn't have a sign outside and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read structures from the inside, that the building she was standing in now had been under construction for 3 years. It was not finished, but the foundation was sound. That was enough to begin.